Welcome everyone for this special performance of Operation Jane Walk. It is a performance we're organizing in collaboration with R.A.U.M, or specifically their project D.R.E.A.M. And we're first going to start with a talk by Martijn de Waal. He is a writer and researcher focusing on the relation between digital media and urban culture. And he's a professor at the Lectorate of Play and Civic Media at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. And he'll frame our beautiful performance in a theoretical context. So we'll have a warm welcome, please, for Martijn de Waal.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, and thanks for being here on a Friday night. I'm very excited about this performance. I saw a sneak preview of it last night, and I can already say that I really enjoyed it. Operation Jane Walk by Leonhard Müllner and Robin Klengel. They're both researchers and visual artists from Vienna, from Austria, living in Graz and in Vienna. And they've also started an artist collective called Total Refusal, a digital disarmament movement. And they will tonight for you perform Operation Jane Walk. And I have the honor to briefly frame the performance. And for me, this work, what I really like about it is that it really addresses this notion of the imagination of future cities. So how is it that we imagine our future cities, and who actually has the power to come up with those images? As you see here, this is a famous picture from the modernist architect Le Corbusier, who had a very strong image of cities, who was also very influential, as we will see in the project later on. And here it's always almost his hand of God, right, that sort of creates the city by his, well, not his act of speech, but his act of willing those, and who has the power to come up with those images? Because the images of cities that we have, they're not just that, they are, as we call that, performative. They influence policymakers, architects, etc. And from the garden cities at the end of the 19th century up to the smart cities today, I think those images are really interesting. And I think for me, a way to approach that is a contrast that Richard Sennett has brought up in his new book, Building and Dwelling. And he speaks about the ville and the cité. And he says the ville, that is the built environment. That's all the physical buildings that are there, the infrastructure, and sort of all the material city that's there. And he contrasts that with the cité. And the cité is the city as we experience it, the city that we project our stories, our hopes, our futures, our desires, the cities that we imagine that we want to be, that we want the city to become. And he describes very beautifully in this book the tension between, on the one hand, the cité, sort of the stories, the imaginations that are out there that influence again the ville, the built environment. And for me, the work that you're about to see is very much about that tension, right? It's about the ville, Manhattan, the built environment, as it has come into being over the last 200 years, I guess, altogether, and the cité, the power to frame the narratives about that city. And it does that on 3 levels, and I just briefly wanted to talk with you about that, to give you a bit more background for the 3 levels of sort of this clash between ville and the cité that I saw there. And the first one is almost on a personal level. There are 2 protagonists, I guess, in the story that will unfold. And the first one is Jane, the Jane from the title, Jane Jacobs. I think many of you have heard of her. Some of you might have also read her beautiful book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And she was a neighborhood activist in the 1960s that opposed the plans of her big nemesis, Robert Moses, the master planner, who, with almost Corbusian powers, willed sort of a modernist New York into being. And I don't know if any of you have indeed read the book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. I can really recommend it. It's not sort of a dry academic analysis of the city. It's really witty and it's full of aphorisms. And to give you a bit of an example, she talks about sort of the projects that are being imagined by the modernist master planners, and she asks herself rhetorically, well, what will these projects look like? Well, yeah, they will be spacious, park-like, uncrowded. They will be orderly, clean, impressive, and monumental. Great, you would think. And then the punchline comes, and she says, well, they will have all the attributes of a well-kept, dignified cemetery, right? And that's a bit of her style, the sort of a nice irony of sort of using the aesthetic qualities of those cities and turning them against themselves. And then Robert Moses, on the other hand, to also frame him sort of in maybe one small quote, when he presented his plan to the board of New York, and there was a lot of resistance from people who were agitated by Jane Jacobs to resist the master plans that he had for New York. Amongst others, he wanted to drive a big highway through Washington Square Park, which was the neighborhood where Jane Jacobs used to live in the West Village. And he said, well, we really have to go through with this because there's nobody against this, nobody but a bunch of mothers, right? And that was sort of his appreciation of the people that were living there, sort of the very sort of old-fashioned top-down master planner that didn't really take the cité of the people that were living there into account. He really wanted to force his version of the city onto New York. And for a large part he did. And for a large part, of course, I think most of you know the history. Jane Jacobs won this battle. Washington Square Park was saved, but not all of New York. And that brings me to the second level, because it was not so much a level about purely aesthetics, about how we want the city to look, the clash between those cités, the one from Robert Moses and from Jane Jacobs. It was also a clash on sort of a more fundamental understanding of what a city is. If we look at the modernist plans, then they were often imagined like this. I don't know if any of you have seen this image before. This was Futurama, an exhibition at the World Exhibition in New York a few years before the Second World War, where indeed the future city was envisioned as, you know, like this, as sort of a city of parks and huge buildings and highways, so you could live in the parks and then you could work in the city, and everything was neatly organized. And the criticism of Jane Jacobs on these kind of master plans was that she said, well, these kinds of plans are bringing order, yes they do, but by repression of all plans but the planners, right? She said, like, well, it's a vision of the city that's very functionalistic, very much top-driven, and her vision of the city was radical the opposite. She said, no, the city is not this functionalist organization of all kinds of activities, but cities should be an open platform. They are fantastically dynamic places which offer fertile ground for the plans of thousands of people. And not just the plan of the planner, but it should be an open forum where everybody can sort of find their space, and there should be understood as complex systems. And I think that's, if you look at the battle between those two cités, those are the two versions that really clash in that discussion. On the one hand, this notion of the city as a linear problem space where we can solve all problems by sort of mathematically studying them and then turning the outcomes of all these equations into, we know exactly how wide our highways should be. And Jane Jacobs, on the other hand, was, and I think for me that's her main heritage, she was proposing to really understand cities as sites of organized complexity, where everything is sort of interdependent, and where you need a different aesthetic to actually accommodate that complexity. So I think that's sort of the battle of the cités. That's at the center of those two imaginations. And that brings me to the third and last level, because what I really like about Operation Jane Walk is that it explores also the power of how are we framing these stories, who is actually telling these stories about our future cities. If we look at it, this is the United Nations building, one of sort of the modernist architecture that will be featured in the perspective. And in a way, I guess you could say that the video game as it is, we can place it maybe in sort of a longer tradition of Hollywood disaster, post-apocalyptic movies, right? Where in American popular culture they really like to destroy the big cities. They're always seen as sort of the evil place that are being threatened by aliens, by capitalism, by natural disasters, etc. But always, often very sort of in a if you compare it to the master planning, a bit in a sort of a top-down simplistic way, right? There is not much room for the complexity of the city and the stories that are there. And for me, what I find really interesting about Operation Genwalk is that they use that framework, but they use it to actually layer it with another version of the cité. So we see images like this, and I think, you know, if we go back to Sennett's division between Ville and Cité, what I really find interesting is that, of course, the representation of Manhattan in the work is sort of the actual Ville that is there, that is being turned into a Cité, sort of a particular story about it. And then what we will see, what will happen next, is that once the performance will start, another layer will be added to that, and we will sort of learn a lot more about the complexities and of the city and of New York and of its planning history than we would from the movie itself. And in a way, it's the authors here sort of taking the power back to create our own cité. And that's what I want to leave it at, and I'm really looking forward to the performance. Thank you very much.
This is New York, a miracle city, a city of tall buildings, narrow, dark streets, magnificent parks, broad avenues, homes and schools, stores and theaters and palatial hotels. A fascinating city, an incredible city, the commercial, financial, trading, and cultural heart of a great nation.
Welcome to Operation Chainwalk, a city tour through the architecture of an online shooter game by
Robin Klengel
and Leonhard Müllner.
Thank you for Martin for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. Thank you also for maybe watching this online, and thank you also for the two very brave people that will come with Leonhard and me now through the city of New York, who will accompany us. It's Ines and Jeroen. Nice that you come with us. Great. And we can have a look around us. Everybody's already in their avatar, in their host body. So I'm the one with the red jacket. That's me. I will be your guide. You basically can just follow me. I know the way. And you in the audience, you will look over the shoulder of Leonhard, who will be the cameraman. And we see we have perfect weather conditions, so it's perfect. And we should maybe just start right away. And please follow me up onto this bus stop here, from which we have a nice view.
So, we are here in the southern part of Midtown Manhattan, or in the southern part of Manhattan here, which is Midtown. And we can have a short glimpse through this framework of this motor highway, and then we have a glimpse of the Eastern River here. This highway is the Franklin D. Roosevelt Highway. We will come to it later. In the back, we have some skyscrapers. Waterside Plaza also will be part of our tour, and we are embraced and surrounded by this wonderful housing project of Stuyvesant Town, which is our first stop.
And maybe we can even see a Brooklyn there shivering through the clouds because we have extraordinary good weather conditions at the moment. It's great. So yeah, as you have seen and as Martin has already mentioned, there's something a bit weird in the city. So all the cars, buses are standing still. It's a post-apocalyptic narrative. There is a great pandemic going on in New York. Which is the framing of this narrative skill game of this ego shooter Tom Clancy's The Division. And it's a state of lawlessness, so it can be dangerous also for us urban flaneurs that just want to see the city. So that's why we carry rifles instead of parasols, and that's why we will look through our scope instead of cameras.
Today we will talk about buildings and urban structures, but also about our protagonists, which have been already partially introduced, which is, of course, Le Corbusier, Donald Trump, and Robert Moses, and his antagonist, which is the title-giving Jane Jacobs.
And this is a pacifistic tour, so we really try to avoid shooting as much as possible. No one should get hurt. We hope we will not die. But in some situations it might happen that we're completely surrounded, and if it really out of self-defense, it might happen that we have to shoot. So you'll be warned. But basically it should go peaceful. And anyways, we cannot leave our guns at home because they are grown onto our bodies. We cannot drop them. It's not possible in this game not to have a gun. And so that's it. But we will talk about the relationship between war and the city. So anyways, that's suits somehow. Maybe you follow me to the first stop on our tour. Please ignore this beggar. We will not lose time now. And as was already mentioned, it's a social housing project which was built in the 40s. It's the Stuyvesant town.
So, important of influence was Le Corbusier for this project here. Le Corbusier, I think everybody or a lot of people know him as a revolutionary thinker and architect. For the modernism itself, he could be supposed to be one of the fathers. He had this ideal image of the ville radieuse, the radiant city, the bright, light, full city, the shining city, which was supposed to mean huge high-rises surrounded by parks, connected with each other with big highways. And as he was visiting New York in the 30s, he was a bit disappointed because most of the high-rises have been a bit too small for him and too numerous. He was planning to demolish New York according to his plan and build it in a new version according to this ville radieuse.
Which you have seen now before in the slides. And the other really important person, also of him we have heard now, it's Robert Moses, an urbanist from New York who was in charge for many, even decades. And he was a man of great dimensions. He radically changed the face of the city and also evicted a lot of people. Here for this quarter, 11,000 people lost their homes, and to make way for this social housing project. And yeah, we can see that it's interesting. It's definitely inspired somehow by Le Corbusier's ideas. So only 25% of the floor of the ground is used with buildings. The rest is green area, and also these X-shaped floor plans are really somehow characteristic, even though they are still probably too narrow and too small for his feeling. But still, you can definitely see the influence.
It was about to battle the housing shortage of the 1940s. He wanted to get rid of the so-called spoiled urban fabric, which was supposed to mean the historical organically grown quarters replaced by uniform settlements. And what was also important, that he wanted to separate. He wanted to separate the races and the social classes meticulously.
So this was only built for white war veterans. Black ones were not supposed to live here, which was changed later. And basically, yeah, it's this big idea of making order in the city and of having clear boundaries somehow, which is one of the main ideas of modernist city planning somehow. Yeah, we would slowly continue. If you have any questions or comments, you are of course very welcome also to ask questions, or whoever is interested. Otherwise, I would suppose we continue to our next stop. We listen to some music in the meanwhile, some Django Reinhardt. You're driving me crazy.
To the right, please.
Please ignore these guys.
These are just enemy bullets. Oh.
We're faster than them, so let's hope they will.
Oh, I think I'm wounded.
You're wounded? Just keep
It's
going.
okay. It's okay.
You're fine, you're fine.
Okay, okay. Definitely shooting at me only.
Yeah. Oh, wait for you.
Again, it's about Robert Moses. Nobody else built more miles of roads than him. His legacy was to frame New York in a kind of a motorway framework, and he was, you can say, the father of the car-driven city. It was caused by the white middle class who moved out of the city into the urban sprawl, and in order to drive to work, they went back into the city. But the more motorways Robert Moses built, the more cars were driving on it.
And
Nevertheless, this kind of car-driven axiom was put on to a lot of other cities all over the world.
And also, so he succeeded in having these huge highways all around the city, but he also had this huge plan of this huge motorway in the center of Manhattan, and other plans who were opposed. And they were opposed, we heard it already, but among others by Jane Jacobs, who questions the urbanist paradigms of her time radically and tries to see the city from a different perspective than these master planners had in mind. And with her, also the era of at least unquestioned car-based planning ended.
Only in post-apocalyptic dystopia, Jacobs' vision of this carless city was finally become reality. New York becomes a pedestrian city right now. No more rushing streams separate urban archipelagos. Manhattan is no longer a hyper-motorized Venice, as it was often described.
And also the congestion, which was, at least according to R.A.U.M. Koolhaas, one, like maybe the essential condition of the city, disappeared. Maybe we can ask ourselves if this isn't maybe the biggest transformation from real New York to the digital space, that it's so quiet somehow, if there's not a shooting going on at least.
So if we looking onto our back, we see these more and more foggy skyscrapers, which is, as I already mentioned, the waterside plaza for skyscrapers which are built on the rubble of old structures.
Yeah, the interesting thing to mention here is that we are on an artificial peninsula, and the story goes back to the Second World War, when the US armament ships brought weapons from the US to Europe. They had to be stabilized somehow when they went back from Europe. And so they just put some rubble on some basically parts of the destroyed cities into the ships to make them stable. And when they came back, they just dropped their cargo here into the East River. And so this peninsula came into being. And then in the 70s, these quite picturesque skyscrapers were erected here. It's quite also social housing, actually. We continue to our next stop. And can maybe say that it might be interesting to say that the version of New York which we are traveling through now is similar, of course, to the real version of New York, but it's not exactly the same. They left out some streets, they left out some more boring or repetitive neighborhoods, and they tried to really condense it. And also they made it more, let's say, friendly for pedestrians. So they're a bit smaller. If you really look carefully, then it's not that many lanes. They're not that broad as they would be in reality somehow. They made it really like nice to walk in somehow. So change it somehow to our needs as players or as flaneurs. And we continue a bit. Let's hope that this. Now he saw us.
Oh, he's always here.
Let's get going through this garden.
With control.
Let's. Everybody's in, great.
So we are in the garden of the Americans' oldest hospital, which is the Bellevue Hospital here. So if we are getting hurt from this guy, we're on the right spot.
It's also the place of the first arterial transplant that happened right here. So it's an important hospital. We get out here. Oh. So let's try let's leave these people pass, because we have to get there. Okay.
The dogs are keeping them distracted.
Okay, they will not see us now, hopefully. So. And we climb onto this green line, which is here.
So, everybody here?
Everybody's there. So this back door should be a bit safer now.
Hoppalat. Yeah. you're well behaving here.
It's good not to get hurt. Yes.
Exactly.
Oh.
This was just a trap.
And as we enter this bleak playground, we see an extra here in the background and a character. And maybe step back, not aim at him, please. Not aim at him. Don't aim at him. And keep distance.
Yeah.
He's here every day. He's a performer. And if you do not disturb him, he will continue with this performance for a very long time. His rhythmic beats make the cadence for this brutalized world. Like a metronome, his hits echo between the houses. We can say this is the beat for this dead city. You want to watch him a bit more, or you're fine?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay, let's get going.
Oh.
There is this nicely placed container here, from which we have a nice view onto these houses.
So, here we see brownstones, houses made of brown sandstone, typical for the eastern coast of America, and they're having this significant stairway going to the portal, to the door, and it's not just for keeping the dirt away from the streets. Of course, they have been built in the fin de siècle or before, when a lot of carriages with horses making the streets very dirty. But also, according to Jane Jacobs, they having a social function.
Yeah, Jane Jacobs wrote about these stoops somehow as being part of the social fabric of the neighborhoods. And she observed this perspective of the common people somehow. And she observed that people were sitting on these stairs, they were chit-chatting, meeting neighbors, watching their children and so on. And it was like a important social part of the neighborhood. And she said that somehow these neighborhoods with those stoops, they work better than those with courtyards, and crime is reduced and places become more lively and friendly and clean, as we can maybe not really see now in these trashed and empty neighborhoods now, but we can imagine that this was once happening here. And we can listen to a song that fits very well.
It's from the Brothers Comatose, from the album Songs from the Stoop. State Building.
Oh, that's not from there.
Go to the left. Oh, they got
They
us.
saw us, they saw us. Keep going, keep going.
Come on.
Is everybody fine?
Still shooting at me.
Yes. They will give up.
Yeah, they will get okay.
So we see a small installation here
What is the
with
explosion?
Christmas trees. They will never picked up for the actual Christmas celebration because Christmas is not celebrated in post-apocalyptic war. So you can say this is a memorial of an anticipation gone cold.
Again, those guys.
Just-
Jesus Christ.
Just
Okay, just
don't,
continue.
not even ignore them.
Oh, no!
Here. We are here.
inside
Here.
there.
Come on.
Where are you?
Go
Yeah,
back.
yeah.
Go back. Follow me.
Inside,
Oh yes,
inside.
okay.
Okay, here we are. Okay. Hope no one's hurt. Not too badly.
Oh.
Not too badly.
These traps are nasty.
Yeah.
So, this is a bit tricky here, so just follow me.
Okay, again.
Okay, and then fire.
So we make a small shortcut.
A little bit of climbing.
Small workout. So
And we can maybe climb up there. On this truck. Let's hope that they leave us alone here. I think they lost track. Right.
So we are here on the top of a parking garage, the dormitory of a car-driven city. The car rests more than 70% of its existence, even 7% more than the most sleepy and lazy domestic animal, which is the cat.
Which is the cat. And as automobiles are being distributed in large numbers, like something like in the 70s or about that time, of course, first of all, the streets get cleaner also, and they stink less and so on. But also, of course, these huge numbers of private cars, they cause a huge logistical challenge. And so a lot of these parking houses are being built in that time. And with the automobile, also the suburban lifestyle became something that was possible to have and to live in some suburban neighborhoods. And with the suburban lifestyle again, then the keeping of domestic animals got more and more popular. So we can say that the spread of automobiles and the spread of cats occurred approximately at the same time in the US-American society, at least.
In the beginning, cars not have been just parked, they have been exhibited in park houses like that, in these car parks, who have become temples, glass houses, temples for the cars. And the science of strolling, the Spaziergangswissenschaften, according to Lucius Burckhardt, was a reaction to this car obsession, and it attempts to reconquer the car parks on foot. Why that? Because of the fantastic view you can have.
And that's what we're doing now. We have a sniper gun in our backpack. We can activate it, and then we aim, and we press tab, and we come to the scope, and we can have a look around this neighborhood. Actually, this is one of the nicest panoramas that you have in the whole game from this parking lot. You can look around, see some houses. And this very large tower there, which is like right in front of us, is a building that you might know, but you might not recognize it because it's the Chrysler building, actually.
Instead of this significant hut, it has this toothpick, and it's maybe digital austerity politics which caused this kind of sparing out this significance.
And before this guy there starts shooting at us, maybe we can continue.
He's this troublemaker.
He's already really hungry. And go a bit further.
So. You know, the professionals, they jump and hurt themselves. And the well-behaving noobs, they just use the staircase, the ladder.
A few steps further, there's something I personally very much like in this game, because this is a construction site that interestingly only exists in the scenery. So in the real physical New York.
Someone's shooting at us.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
But it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. Just go behind this truck here.
I will try to finish soon. So, in real-time New York, this doesn't exist, and here it's already a construction site. So the game is actually somehow ahead of the real development of the city. So let's continue. Let's leave this.
This is a fantasy company just
advertising this with some.
But it is in fact it is a investment fiasco, no?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, the investor got bankrupt because of losing the money for tearing down the building. Let's hope that they don't follow us up to this place here.
So
maybe a few more steps.
So here we do have a playground. Usually it is a playground in physical reality. Here it is appropriated militarily again, and it would not have been any playground. It is the specific Robert Moses playground. Robert Moses playground. Robert Moses built a lot of playgrounds in New York, 255, and just 2 of them have been built in districts with a community of people with color. This was again this implementation of racist urban planning. Robert Moses was a convinced racist. He wanted to separate black and white populations. Some motorway bridges have been extra low. City buses used by Afro-Americans cannot get through. No mixing there.
So, and this, he was very influential, so he could influence a lot of details even. He could even control the water temperature in public swimming pool. And he decided that this shouldn't be over a certain temperature level so that the black swimmers would not use the swimming pool. So it's quite a crazy small details.
He had also his New Deal Keynesianism side, which was kind of social democratic.
Of course. He built a lot of social housing projects as well. So
he's an ambivalent figure.
Quite. Yeah. Let's a few more steps further. We see something that everybody probably has seen already. This is the UN headquarters, built in '52. You have seen it before. And in this, the vision of world peace finds its form, or at least that was the idea. You can say that after Second World War, there is a consensus among the nations that a strong international institution is needed to prevent such catastrophes from happening. And UN is searching for a place for the new world capital, and they find New York. They decide to build it here. Interestingly, they built it in the so-called Bloody Alley, so the slaughterhouse district of the city. And Robert Moses also has a finger in the pie here, since he removes all bureaucratic obstacles for building this within a single day.
In order to design a suitable monument for this new world order, an international board of architects was gathered together, and Le Corbusier was invited for France, and he saw his chance coming to convince the city of his plans of the Ville Radieuse, which we spoke before. His draft was leading the way. He was dominating the whole board of architects, and you see, for example, this stark, naked, modernist shape of this huge skyscraper in front of us, which does not resemble any previous era. The style is minimalistic. It's very, like, this is one of the most important icons of modernism. But the winning design comes not from the Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer, and an American architect was commissioned to create the final product. It was Wallace Harrison, which caused an outrage of Le Corbusier, and he angrily departed.
And the building was also controversially discussed in the city. Not everybody liked it. It was something really strange, obviously. One point of criticism, which I can understand, is that the defining shape is actually the Secretariat and not the Assembly Hall, which we can see there on the left. So it's this big monolith and not the Assembly Hall. So seeming to indicate that it's more the administration that dominates rather than the international understanding. But it does still mark a break in style, and post-war New York is more built in this modernist style, these glass cubes, and not the classicist buildings as we see them in our back. Yeah.
So let's go
Continue.
to New York of the 50s and 60s, which have been the most important time maybe for this city, in which 40,000 fabrics have been built here or have been working here. 1 million workers have been working here. New York was called the production center of the world, and it was also called what else?
The headquarters city also.
Headquarters.
Because many companies had their headquarters here in that time. They moved it to New York.
A lot of the most important.
And one of these super important corporations was the Ford Motor Company, and we see in our back the Ford Foundation, which is a foundation founded by the Ford Company, and they aim to spread democracy, fight against poverty, for international understanding, and so on. And they built this office building here in the 60s, which is it's really a shame we don't see it, but in the inside it's a glass house. It's a subtropical climate glass house, and also an office building. But what we do see is these raw steel beams and these concrete pillars in some, could say, elegant massiveness, which is inspired by motorway and bridge architecture.
Inside these offices have been made just out of glass so that every employee can see each other or survey each other. There was even a service department in this panopticum of Ford, which was called Ford's Gestapo, which was checking the employees, even their furniture style at home.
And as you might know, that Ford was also a very convinced anti-Semite, but he was also a pacifist, and he wasn't for the Second World War, or he was a war opponent in the US, but in the end he was convinced, and he helped to combat the Nazis. He equipped thousands of American tanks with his engines, and in the end also the company profited very much from the war, or from these war commissions, and so they could afford this fancy foundation afterwards.
In order to guarantee world peace, yeah.
Let's continue a few steps down this street. While we're running, maybe we can say that there are a few steps to the left, or maybe a few steps further. We see something like a very simplified version of the Daily News building, built by Raymond Hood in the 30s, which was an important building because it was of this reduced minimalist Art Deco style, kind of important for creation of modern architecture. And this building also we have already seen on the walk a bit before.
Which is the Chrysler building. And now you may understand why you don't have a hat on the top, because you don't see it.
Usually
from
the
here,
perspective
from
is
below.
like that,
Yeah.
doesn't
So,
make sense.
no good city tour without a look into the guts. Let's go down to the sewers of the city.
The New York sewer system is one of the biggest on the planet, as you can maybe imagine. And the amount of daily processed feces of this this whole system is bigger than the total weight of all the elephants on Earth. So, like a fun fact also for this tour, it's good to have. Huh? And we can maybe listen to a song that suits the environment.
Let's fill our auditory canals with Art Caney, Songs from the Sewers.
Everybody's there?
I work in the sewer, it's a very hard job. You know they won't hire just any old slob. You don't have to wear a tie or a coat. You just have to know how to float. We sing the song of the sewer. Of the sewer, we sing this song.
So, we are from the sewer system to the maintenance gangways now in the railway system, in the underground railway system, which was built from 1904 to 1940s. And then nothing happened. 40 years, cause who was in charge of urban planning? It was Robert Moses. Robert Moses not built any single mile of subway railroads, because he was a convinced traffic individualist. 40 years nothing happened, and in the 80s they started again to improve the system. New York is still suffering from this ignorance on public traffic.
And let's try to get out safe. Usually there's some not so friendly
Uppsala.
people down there. Yeah, here they are.
Oh.
So let's try to sprint a little bit further. Let's let them shoot.
Outs.
If we are fast enough, we can again escape. There to the left.
We have a new colleague here. Did he pay? Oh no, he didn't. So.
Few steps out of the railroad system. We come to the surface again.
There we see the central station of New York.
Yes. But we will not talk about it. Rather, we will talk about something else, which we find very interesting.
So, great. Here we have a small installation with a huge expressiveness. We see a pickup composed into the public bicycle rental system. It somehow shows this battle between the motorized and the non-motorized traffic.
This pickup, this RAM, how it can also be called, stands for these old ideas of individualized, motorized, guzzling transport. And this stubborn pickup, he's entangled here in the ironwood of these bicycles. This public rental system was established under Traffic Administrator Janet Sadiq Khan. And under her time of work, New York faced something like a paradigm change in city planning. And she saw bicycle lanes, bus lanes, and pedestrian areas as being healthy for the city, successful in places like Times Square, which you might also have heard, which was transformed into a pedestrian area.
yeah, we have here this fight of these two concepts, memorialized in this sculpture, quite brilliant by the game developers, even whether they did it consciously or not.
Any comments? Good. So we continue.
Hoppala, was ist denn das schon wieder?
There's someone shooting again. Maybe. Oh.
This is
Did you get hurt? Maybe on the way to the left we see a big hotel complex, which is the Grand Hyatt Hotel. Used to be it was the Commodore Hotel in the beginning of the 20th century, one of the best addresses in town. But it got into financial troubles. In the 70s, it was nearly bankrupt, and then the city invested a lot of money in order to make it anew. And so it was completely changed, completely to the skeleton changed, and you can hardly remember how it once have looked like. And the interesting thing is that the person who was responsible for it, the investments developer, real estate developer, was Donald Trump. So he becomes a character of the city at this time. And we continue. Is everybody here? We wait for you a few seconds.
Oh.
Just come here. Okay, let's continue. Okay.
So, take this step to here, up here, and then with enter, just seek cover.
Come a bit closer. See, here is a good place for
because there is
cover.
Somebody. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe you just go around it and
Yes.
exactly perfect.
So
we should be safe.
we can admire this R.A.U.M building in front of us, this MetLife building, how it is called today, which was built in the 1960s as a monument of the triumph of capitalism and the new world order. All corporations headquarters on the tour have profited greatly from World War II. This is the poster boy of this story. R.A.U.M building was once dedicated to civilian aviation, and in the Second World War it was asked to have also been commissioned for military aviation. The design comes from Le Corbusier and realized was it by Walter Gropius, among others.
And later R.A.U.M got in financial trouble, and it was bought by MetLife insurance company. They put their logo on the facade, which now interestingly is gone. We cannot see it anymore. But it's so no one claims this building, which used to be one of the, or maybe the biggest office building in the world for a while.
Just these brutes having their tasteless tattoo logo here on the building. But maybe let's leave this uncomfortable situation with Stay Flying in Our Ears from the song We Fly the World, which is R.A.U.M's official commercial.
Get with disoriented. Yeah. Just a bit further to the left. We're under attack. We should just for a second see this interesting other sculpture here.
Fountain sculpture, maybe from the same artist, because there is a R.A.U.M. So.
There.
So. We are a clusterfuck right now. So we're having here a graffiti. And these graffitis have been made, of course, by physical real artists, 22 international graphic graffiti artists have been commissioned to do this in order to somehow find or have been commissioned to do this with the topic of post-apocalypse.
And in front of us, another building we would like to comment
on is the Waldorf Astoria, which was built in the 1930s as the biggest hotel complex in the world, which is bizarre because the biggest hotel complex was built in the economic crisis. However, the ballroom serves as the most important social hub for the city. It was also the center of political power, especially in the Cold War period. 1946, the conference of the Big Four has been taken place in the private lobby of the boss of the hotel.
And even more important for the Cold War was the so-called Waldorf Peace Conference, which is the last event that was organized by the Communist Party in the USA. It was financed by donations of prominent philanthropists like Albert Einstein or Leonhard Bernstein. And it should discuss the upcoming break between the US and the USSR after the war. And yeah, they gathered together, but in the end, it ended with an anti-communist scandal and a break between the two factions in the USA. And the Cold War takes a decisive turn here in this place. We should maybe mention that also here they didn't make the head of the building somehow. It's difficult to actually recognize.
Also remarkable is that the most important generals of the Second World War, not the Germans, but the Americans, have been living there as generals in residence. Among them was General Douglas MacArthur. Later, almost he was commanding a nuclear strike against China in Korean War. Let's listen to a hymn for him by C.W. Stoneking, Brave Son of America.
And continue. So, and ladies and gentlemen, I can proudly tell you that we're now standing in front of maybe the most important building in New York's architectural history, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe's C.G.R.A.M building from the year 1958. Or we actually don't see it because C.G.R.A.M is exactly on this parcel of the Park Avenue. It has exactly the same floor plan and it has also this significant forecourt, also this freestanding column. So it definitely is this building, but obviously the Ubisoft they kind of didn't felt it necessary to rebuild this architectural lighthouse. They didn't build the famous bronze facade and replaced it by this generic glass front here.
Of course, also C.G.R.A.M is entangled in Second World War. The modernist pioneers such as Breuer, Gropius and Mies van der Rohe fled from the Nazi regime to the USA and gained very shortly after it positions at the American universities. And the American press embraced this architectural style. They brought with them as a kind of anti-German propaganda, anti-Nazi propaganda, and it inspired the rise of modernism all over the USA. Very unique about the Seagram is its spaciosity. It's very generous with space and light. It's not built upon to the edge of this parcel to the sidewalk. It does not use the maximum of its space. Instead, it steps nobly back and leaves expensive land undeveloped. You can say it's one of the most expensive office building in the world because of that.
And yeah, it's interesting. Before the war, the modernist architecture is mainly concerned with social issues, or social issues are super important. After the war, the Seagram building and also modernist architecture in the West become symbols for the power of capitalism. So, interesting story, for instance, is in the year 1962, 6 Swiss armed forces presented nuclear missile rockets here on the forecourts of this building. So the architecture becomes background for a military muscle parade and a cultural weapon in the battle of ideologies. That's the story.
What was Seagram dedicated to?
Yeah, Seagram was a company for booze, for alcohol. Got rich through smuggling in the Prohibition time. And
that's why we hear now Oliver Nelson's
Booze Blues Baby.
Booze Blues Baby.
Get in this house. Ah!
Yeah.
Hope you don't attract attention. We can see the Rockefeller Center to the left, there in the background.
Or in front of us, yeah.
We will not comment on it. And we are slowly approaching the last building on our tour, which also marks a break in the narrative.
And a break in architecture and social history, you can say. In the 1960s, the city saw economic growth. The 1970s have been suffering by the oil crisis. Production sites move out of the city. A deindustrialization of the city of Manhattan began, and city of New York. Manhattan faces exodus and a financial crisis occurs. The city is close to bankruptcy, and because of this, bank institutions are asked to take over the governmental tasks. And the Troika forces New York to austerity politics. This is the time in which the ideology of neoliberalism rises.
And about the same time, also this phenomenon, which Saskia Sassen describes as global cities, emerges. So decision processes are more and more concentrated and power concentrated in these big international super hubs. And globalization is getting on another level, and also capital concentrates. Also, the elites, in some sense, get interested in the cities again after some time.
Foremost in the cores of the cities. And in this time, Donald Trump becomes a character of the history of the city. He buys cheap buildings like the Bonwit Teller store, which stands before here, and demolishes, or used to stand here before, and demolishes it. He builds luxury apartments and hotels like the Trump Tower in front of us on this parcel. The desperate municipality grants him generous loans and tax abatements, and you can say it is a subsidized living space for the elite, which has taken place. Manhattan becomes an island of the rich.
And also at this time we can see that there is a change in taste also concerning architecture, and modernist architecture is not interpreted as progressive any longer, but becomes somehow cold and anonymous. People don't like it anymore somehow. And wealth, also from the elites, wasn't hidden so much more, but much more proudly presented, and concrete disappears behind glass facades. Trump Tower, which we see in front of us, built in '83 by architect D.R.E.A.M, it has somehow a minimalist exterior, but in the inside it's a superabundance of gold and specially imported Italian marble. And now as Trump has become president, this place has become a political center, center for political power as well, maybe to be compared to the Waldorf Astoria hotel in the 30s.
In this post-apocalyptic version of New York, his symbol of rain goes into debris and sinks into the post-apocalyptic snow. Our story ends here. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to all the people who built this scenery. They have memorialized important parts of the history of the 20th century in digital space, which is maybe the perfect material for an artistical appropriation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Well, thank you for that wonderful performance. You guys must have been exhausted. This is one of the first city tours that I saw that people did completely running for 1 hour. I think you covered at least 10 miles or something like that.
You see how fit we look?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for that. I truly enjoyed it. I think it was really interesting, full of inversions and juxtapositions. You say we start out, we're flaneurs, but we carry urban rifles, and you start with sort of the upbeat sound of the, I think it was the Futurama exhibition, right? The introduction, little upbeat text about how beautiful New York is and how beautiful it's going to be, and you contrast that with sort of the post-apocalyptical city. And I think the story that you showed us is also really interesting. What I really took out of it was also this, where you ended, sort of this shift of modernist architecture that started out as a more social way of providing housing for the working class, for all the people, and how through the history of New York it was, of course, first adopted by Robert Moses, an ambiguous figure who is both building all these social houses, but at the same time also being very racist, as you pointed out. But then modernist architecture becoming more and more a symbol of capitalism, and then always turning further into global cities. And I think for me that's really a great example of what of how I read your piece, where you're trying to make your own story about New York and add that to this video game. And I think you're almost doing two things at the same time, right? On the one hand, you're showing us the subversive potential of video games, right, where you can use a game to actually tell a story that's not in the game itself, and you're also telling a story about or sort of your own version of the history of architecture in New York. And my first question is, which came first? Was it that you started off with this idea, hey, let's use a video game and see if we can tell a completely different story, or were you sort of really interested in telling this story about the architectural history of New York?
No, it started with gaming. We're playing games, this is how it started. But yeah, of course, we played this game, this Division, which is I mean, you've seen it. It's crazy. They have this huge area of New York, which, I mean, it's hundreds of people being involved in these video games. That's like that's billions of dollars or euros are being invested in these landscapes, and then the only thing you can do there is shooting and follow some stupid limited narrative. So yeah, somehow we went around and we saw architecture, which we found interesting, and then we kind of realized that it's just a great tool to talk about architecture and about the things we're actually interested in. Also, somehow that's how this came into being, I guess.
Yeah, and afterwards we did not play any longer. We just ran to different buildings in Manhattan, and then we had this kind of Karl May approach to never have been there actually in New York ourselves physically, but we want to talk to the other people how it looks there and what is to see there. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, you could have also made a movie documentary about it, maybe even also without going there, by just downloading movies from YouTube and sort of putting them behind each other and provide the same commentary. But the game element was very important for you guys, right? To really use the game engine as a way of storytelling.
There is since the 90s, since computer games have been really gone commercial, become commercial product. Also, it becomes an interesting material for artist appropriation. What bothers me is that this really ventilized and important and blown up media of entertainment media of computer games is not bothered enough from artists, because it's a bit sticky, nerdy media. So people just continue on making artworks about Godard or about 60 millimeters, which is totally fine. But the representation of art from about computer games and those about film history is a bit maybe it's different as like this importance of the media, which so reflects into society right now, and the younger generation are completely somehow getting like when I think what teaches me what was good and bad in the time when I was a child or a teenager. Of course, it has been TV, yeah, in the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, and now it's the computer game, yeah.
Yeah, right. So the stories of what is a good city, when is a city, what is this kind of city that we want to live in, what do we expect from the city, those stories are actually told through computer games, through many people. So it's important to sort of use that medium also to broaden the scope of those stories and build more layered stories and versions of that. And I think you succeeded very well in that. I'm looking at the same time whether maybe you have already any questions. Are there any questions in the audience at this time already? Yeah?
Yeah. I'm very curious about how you dealt with the various reality levels in the game. Like sometimes you acknowledge that you're in a game, and sometimes you pretend that it's a city tour. Maybe there's other levels. Was it like a struggle to find the right moments for the right reality levels, or how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's somehow, even especially if you are there with guiding people through, I mean, you cannot completely ignore these bullets and stuff. You somehow have to comment it. And yeah, basically we try to have all these layers in somehow, and to build a bridge also from this, from talking about real history and then talking about this very specific version of New York, which is a specific transformation, which is somehow consumable for the game. Yeah, I think we have been thinking a lot about where this makes sense, and I mean, it's funny, that somehow this is a pedestrian area. The whole city has become pedestrian area. Everybody is running around there. No car is moving. Somehow we found it quite inspiring, that how much the city can change, and even though they didn't probably think about it, this wasn't the first idea to make a pedestrian area out of New York and then make a game out of it, but it was more the opposite. But we like that somehow.
Yeah, I think that irony is also very strong in your work, where you say that, for example, walkability is finally achieved now that the city is in a post-apocalyptic state. Here's another question.
Yeah, well, like my question was like a connection to what Arjon just said about the reality levels. Like it's also sort of like a hyper reality in a sense that you know, if you just look at the development of New York from this historical point of view to like the power of capitalism and the state of capitalism now, it's sort of like also the imagination of like possible histories. So I was like wondering to what extent like the universe of the game in this like post-apocalyptic state also like a sort of is a continuation of yeah, like this reflection. I don't know the background of the story of the game, but could you go a bit more into like the background of what's happening, like who is the enemy and what happened that made New York post-apocalyptic?
When you're talking about this capitalist hyper reality, I think you refer to this dystopian surrounding, which is seen by Deleuze as swallowing everybody and.
The dystopian depiction of New York actually feels remarkably real, whereas like sort of seeing like the power of capitalism in function just every day around like on TV feels remarkably unreal, and that's like the hyper reality that I was referring to.
Yeah. This is a different reality, like this dystopian reality in which capitalism takes over, than this hyper-reality discussed on an aesthetical level onto the media of computer games, because it tries to be better than reality. And it's in fact like this. Everything is completely staged and there is no coincidence except some bugs. And when it's up to the story, Robin, maybe you?
Yeah, maybe to explain it a bit more. So the story of the game is that there's kind of a huge pandemic in New York, and so that's the scenario. And so somehow politics decide to close New York with a big wall and to seclude it, and basically everybody's trying to escape, but they try to keep people in. And then it's kind of this, all this craziness going on, some gangs, and all the prisons are being opened, and I mean, in the end, it was the Russians, and it's completely
and the Chinese who have been responsible for this mess. It's like going back into the James Bond narratives a bit. How these blockbuster storytellings of these AAA games taking place. Like they don't challenge the gamers so much in what they're doing. There is no dilemma in which the gamer is put into. It's just that you have to make order and to save people because nobody else can do.
Yeah, and it's also really clear. There's people with guns; those are bad guys. You can shoot them, and there's people without guns. They're civilians, and you don't have to think. You cannot even not shoot them, and this is super obvious. And I mean, this is quite crazy if you think, because one element, for instance, is that all the prisons are being opened in New York. And all the gangsters are now out, and of course these gangsters are bad guys, and you can just shoot them, and they're like, that's kind of.
And to what extent? Because the way you explain it right now, it also reminds me a lot of movies that were made in, I think, the end of the 80s, early 90s, like Escape from New York, Escape from LA, where also the city has become a big, giant open-air prison, and the rich people lived in the gated communities around that. And then, of course, mayhem happens within the city, etc. And the sort of the more beautiful, quiet places are also threatened. But those movies you could also read as a criticism on sort of dual cities that have been emerging with gated communities and neglect inner neighborhoods. Is there this critical potential in the game itself as well, or doesn't it not address that at all?
Not in this particular game. That's why we are having this total refusal collective, which is an open collective, by the way. and it's about to question the narratives in the game. I think I don't have a personal problem with shooting in computer games, but it has to be embedded in some kind of narrative reflection. What you do, you have also to face consequences, and there are some good games who do. And when it comes to like this is Ubisoft. This is the biggest publisher and game development company in the world. Situated, its headquarters situated in Paris, and they really it suffers from the same problems like blockbuster or Hollywood cinema. They're making much more money than films Hollywood productions do, and so you have a lot of authors and writers, script writers who are in charge, and then the producer just chooses the most convenient one. Yeah, so there is this is really particular. And one side thing I want to say about Escape from New York, because now as I have this stage, I want to use it properly. It's when it comes to digitality in this 80s film, or I think 79 film, it was they wanted to make a digital grid of the city in order to somehow surveil it before the plane lands on it, and to do so they just built it physically with physical models and draw these lines, because the digital grid was too expensive. Yeah, so back then for this kind of production. Today we make completely the opposite. Like we do this with the computer because the physical real thing would be too expensive. Yeah.
And then in the process, as you pointed out, we reshape the city according to the logic of the game rather than to the real city, where the highways are not so broad anymore and the city has become pedestrianized, etc., which I think was also a very interesting thing that you pointed out. Are there any more questions? Maybe I have another question. Of course, the project is called Operation Jane Walk. Of course, referring to Jane Jacobs and sort of her controversy with Robert Moses. To what extent was sort of the thinking of Jane Jacobs also inspiring you? Because in the project you mostly talk about Moses. We learn a lot about him. Jane Jacobs is mostly in the title, but to what extent was her work actually inspirational for your interpretation?
I mean, of course, it was of great importance in that sense that as we see this. Somehow, I mean, we refer in the title. We refer to the Jane Walk, which is something that you might have heard of. It's something that goes on every year on her birthday. All in many cities of the world, there's Jane Walks.
Also in Utrecht. Yeah.
And there is. This means that people gather together, and it's like guided tours through the city, but it's not done by any super professional tour guide or something, but it's done by the residents. So it's the people that live there. Show around other people, and in that sense also appropriated. And it's a lot about, of course, to see the city through the eyes of the normal people that live there, because they're most experts. And this was the idea also here for the thing. So to kind of give back this landscape to the players. And as we are players as well, we thought we can just adopt this into the digital space and have the same perspective shift somehow.
For me, the title also had this extra connotation of the word jaywalking, of course, which in America means it's actually illegal to cross the road on a particular place. And I guess for me, what you were trying to do was also reclaim the city for the pedestrian in a particular way. So I also like that aspect of the title and the project. Maybe to round off, unless there are other questions in the audience. Maybe you can tell a little bit more about your collective, because it's called a digital disarmament movement. Can you tell us a little bit more about what exactly you mean with that aspect of disarmament?
this is referring to this peace movement in Germany of the 80s, and it's basically an attempt to use this material, as I said before, of the computer games and this media in a peaceful way, and to question why it always has to be like the solutions or the gameplay always has to be military, and why also the justification of solving problems always have to be. We are facing the big games and not like the indie games, because the indie games are of course those who are criticizing or experimenting more, and it's important for us to just use this blockbuster scenery in order to work in it. They build not only cities, they build continents. Like the ancient Greece was recently built with all these islands in the new Assassin's Creed, and they just fill it with generic gameplay and narratives. So we call it, for example, screensaver online shooter or something, because everything is so. You can use this. I come from the public space, from art in public space, and I want to intervene into this kind of space as I would intervene in the physical real public space, but with other conditions. I can make other stuff there, like I can pile cars, for example, which I can't do easily here in Utrecht. Yeah.
But the basic idea is to collect works and to do new artworks that try to intervene into violent narratives with peaceful intentions, and to make use of these crazy worlds that they build and create other narratives and somehow work on this.
Subvert those narratives. I just read on the web that actually Tom Clancy's Division now has a sequel, Washington D.C. So I think maybe that's a nice challenge for you guys to come back next year and take us on a Jane walk through Washington D.C.
Maybe as a resident, no?
Okay. Well, I think we're going to leave it at that. We're going to continue the conversation at the bar. Thank you so much, Leonhard Müllner and Robin Klengel, for your performance, Operation Jane Walk.
Thank you.